The morning of August 14th, 14 flights at O'Hare International Airport went dark on the departure board simultaneously. Not delayed, not rescheduled, just gone. Thousands of passengers stood frozen, staring up at screens that offered no explanation. Gate agents grabbed phones. Supervisors rushed across terminals. The FAA hotline rang off the hook. Nobody could understand it. There had been no storm warning, no mechanical emergency, no security threat called in. Just silence and a fuel supply that had quietly, deliberately, completely stopped flowing. What nobody in that terminal knew yet was that 3 hours earlier, a 19-year-old girl in a worn green hoodie had been dragged out of seat 2A by her arm, while an entire first-class cabin watched and said nothing. What nobody knew was that before she lost her phone, she had made one call. 4 seconds, no words, just breathing and her father picking up on the other end. This is the story of what happens when you humiliate the wrong person in the wrong seat on the wrong day. If you want to know how one 4-second phone call brought an entire airport to its knees, hit subscribe right now because this story does not slow down. Drop a comment with your city and your local time. I want to see exactly how far this reaches. And do not leave before the end, because the moment that changed everything isn't the one you think it is. My name is Zoe Carter, and I have spent most of my life trying to disappear. Not literally, I'm not the kind of person who fades into corners or forgets to speak up in class. Ask anyone at Columbia University, and they'll tell you I'm the girl in the front row who asks the question nobody else wants to ask. The girl who stays after seminar to argue constitutional precedent with the professor. The girl who reads case files on Friday nights because she genuinely finds them interesting. But outside of school and airports and hotel lobbies and every space where people make split-second decisions about who belongs and who doesn't, I learned a long time ago to make myself invisible. Not because I wanted to, because I was exhausted by the alternative. The green hoodie I was wearing that morning was old. The cuffs were frayed. The front pocket had a small tear near the zipper that I kept meaning to fix but never did. I'd had it since junior year of high school when my mother took me shopping at a thrift store in Evanston on a random Tuesday afternoon just because she felt like it. She believed in thrift stores with the same conviction she believed in everything else, that the value of something had absolutely nothing to do with its price tag. My mother believed a lot of things like that. Diana Carter had been a civil rights attorney for 22 years. She had argued in front of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals 3 times. She kept a shelf in her office that held nothing but the case files of people who couldn't afford to fight back people she represented for free quietly, without ever mentioning it at dinner parties. She wore her natural hair in a crown of gray streaked locks and told me once that the day she stopped being afraid of taking up space was the day she became truly dangerous in a courtroom. She died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Stage 4 diagnosed in October, gone by March. I was 15 years old. My father, Marcus Carter, did not fall apart. I don't say that like it was easy. I say it like it was a decision he made every single morning, the same way he made every choice in his life. Deliberately, completely, with full understanding of the cost. Marcus was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and arrived in the United States at 22 years old with $200 a mechanical engineering degree and a certainty that bordered on irrational that he was going to build something in this country. It took him 11 years. Carter Fuel Dynamics now supplied aviation fuel to 65% of airports along the East Coast, with contracts extending to hubs in Chicago, Atlanta, and Dallas. Forbes had profiled him 3 times. He had declined every interview personally. He was also the most overprotective father I had ever encountered in my 19 years of living. The first-class ticket on my phone seat to a Skybridge Airlines, Flight 447 from O'Hare to JFK, departing 10:45 a.m., had cost $4,800. My father purchased it 3 months in advance without telling me, then informed me of the arrangement the week before my flight with a tone that made clear the matter was not open for discussion. I hadn't wanted first class. I had miles accumulated from the past year of travel and could have booked myself comfortably into economy. But my father had rules. No standby flights. Direct routes only. First class always, because he had read too many incident reports and was not willing to do the math on my safety against the price difference. I had learned to pick my battles. The hoodie was one of them. The sneakers were another. I arrived at O'Hare Terminal 3 at 8:20 a.m., nearly 2 hours before boarding, because my father also had strong feelings about airport timing that I had long stopped arguing with. The terminal hummed with familiar summer energy families with strollers, business travelers with rolling luggage, and focused exhaustion, college students hauling overstuffed backpacks and running on overpriced coffee. I bought a black coffee from a kiosk near gate G14 and found a seat by the window. Below, planes moved slowly across the tarmac, guided by ground crews in orange vests. There was something honest about airports, I always thought. Everyone was going somewhere. Everyone was temporarily suspended between who they were in the place they left and who they would be in the place they were headed. My phone buzzed. Head down today, baby girl. Security confirmation received at JFK for your arrival. Call me when you land. Love you more than my next billion dad. I smiled despite myself. His jokes never improved. That was part of their value. I texted back a single heart and finished my coffee. There was something my mother used to do before any situation she suspected might turn difficult. She would pause completely still and take 3 slow breaths. Not for calm, she always said. Calm was just the byproduct. She breathed to think clearly, to catalog everything around her, to make sure that whatever happened next, she had already seen the full picture. Look before they look away, she told me once. Notice everything. You may need it later. I gathered my bag and joined the priority boarding lane at gate G14, 9:55 a.m. There were 2 things I noticed in that first moment that I would think about many times in the days to come. The first was the expression on the gate agent's face when she looked up and saw me, that particular flicker, barely a second long, that I had learned to read the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. The second was the flight attendant standing just inside the jet bridge door. She was watching, and when our eyes met, she didn't look away immediately. She held my gaze for just a beat longer than she needed to. Then she turned away. Her name, I would learn later, was Gloria Reyes. And that single moment of hesitation, that one held breath between a stranger and a choice, would end up mattering more than either of us could have known in the ordinary morning light of Terminal 3. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I had a boarding pass, a valid ticket, and a seat that belonged to me. I stepped forward. The gate agent's name was Diane Walsh, according to the badge clipped to her navy blazer. She was somewhere in her mid-40s with a particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from one bad night, but from many long months of accumulated exhaustion. Her hair was pulled back tightly. There was a coffee stain on her left sleeve that she had clearly noticed and clearly stopped caring about. The crease between her eyebrows suggested she had been frowning for a long time before I walked up. I recognized that look. Not the look of someone who had woken up that morning deciding to be cruel. The look of someone grinding through hour 11 of what should have been an 8-hour shift running on vending machine coffee and the professional obligation to remain upright. I want to be precise about what happened next because I have replayed it so many times in the months since that I can see it almost frame by frame. Diane looked up from her screen when I approached the priority lane. Her eyes traveled quickly, automatically, the way a scan gun moves over a barcode from my face down to my hoodie, across to my frayed cuffs, down to my Converse sneakers and back up to my face. The whole assessment took approximately 2 seconds. It was not dramatic. It was not accompanied by a sneer or a pointed comment. That was almost the worst part. It was so practiced, so unconscious, that I wasn't sure in that first moment whether I had imagined it. Priority lane is for first-class passengers and Skybridge elite status members, she said. Her voice was flat, not hostile, just flat the way you go flat after you've said the same sentence 500 times. If you're in economy, you'll want to line up with the main boarding group. Zone 3 will be called in about 25 minutes. She had already looked back at her screen before finishing the sentence. I stood still for a moment. This was the calculation I had learned to run quickly, automatically in situations like this one. Was she reacting to me specifically, or was she just tired and doing her job badly? Was this a policy she applied to everyone who approached the priority lane in casual clothing? Or was there something else informing her assumption? I had been through enough of these moments to know that the answer was rarely clean, rarely obvious, and almost never admitted to by the person doing it. I also knew that hesitating too long looked uncertain, and uncertain got dismissed faster. I'm in first class, I said. My voice was calm. I kept it that way deliberately. Seat 2A. I have my boarding pass right here. I held out my phone with the boarding pass clearly displayed. Diane glanced at the screen. Just a glance, the kind you give something you're not particularly interested in confirming. Then she looked at me again. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening, more like a door closing. If you purchased a first-class upgrade using reward points, the terms of your original ticket class still apply to boarding priority, she said. You'd need to board with your base fare group. I didn't use reward points, I said. I purchased a full first-class ticket. Miss, I have passengers behind you. I understand. I'm just asking you to scan the pass. There was a pause. A specific kind of pause that I had come to understand as the moment where a person decides whether to acknowledge reality or defend the position they've already committed to. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then Diane reached out, took my phone with the brisk efficiency of someone performing a task they considered unnecessary, and pressed it to the scanner. The beep was immediate. Green light, Johnson Zoe. Seat 2, aka Skybridge First Class. Welcome aboard. The automated voice was cheerful in the way only machines can be completely indifferent to the weight of the moment it was participating in. I watched Diane's face. I watched it carefully the way my mother had taught me to watch faces in courtrooms and negotiating rooms, in all the places where what people show and what they feel are never quite the same thing. Surprise moved through first genuine unguarded, then something that looked almost like irritation, though I couldn't tell if it was directed at me or at herself. Her jaw tightened slightly. She handed my phone back without meeting my eyes. Go ahead, she said. 2 words, that was all. No apology, no acknowledgement, no moment of recognition that she had been wrong, that the assumption she had made in 2 seconds had been exactly that, an assumption, not a policy, not a procedure, not a professional judgment. Just go ahead, as if the interaction had been a minor administrative inconvenience now resolved and we could all move on. I took my phone back. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that this was the moment where responding cost more than it returned. I walked down the jet bridge with my bag over one shoulder and the boarding pass still glowing on my screen, and I made myself breathe evenly the way my mother had taught me. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow enough to feel each breath separately. They are not the measure of you, she used to say. Their assumptions tell you what they see. Your response tells you who you are. I had repeated those words to myself in a lot of jet bridges, a lot of elevator lobbies, a lot of quiet moments after interactions that left me feeling hollowed out in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. It was not fury exactly. It was something quieter and heavier than fury. It was the particular exhaustion of being consistently underestimated by people who would never know they were doing it, who would go home that evening and not think about it once. The jet bridge curved slightly to the right before opening into the aircraft door. The air changed, cooler, climate-controlled, carrying that distinctive scent of recirculated cabin air and leather seating. Gloria Reyes was standing just inside the door. She was in her mid-30s, I guessed, in the standard Skybridge uniform, dark hair, pinned precisely beneath her wings pin. She had a warm, professional smile, ready, the kind that gets deployed automatically at the door of every flight for every passenger 200 times a day. But when I stepped through and our eyes met, something happened to that smile. It didn't disappear. It just paused. For one fraction of a second, Gloria Reyes looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not pity, not guilt. Something more complicated than either of those things. She had been watching from inside the door. She had seen everything. Then the smile returned and she said, "Welcome aboard, miss. First class is to your right." I thanked her and turned right, and behind me I heard her exhale, barely audible, the kind of breath a person releases when they have just finished making a decision they aren't entirely sure about. I didn't look back. I should have. The first-class cabin of Skybridge Flight 447 was the kind of space designed to make certain people feel like the world had been arranged specifically for their comfort. 12 seats total, configured in a 2x2 layout with generous space between each row. The upholstery was a deep charcoal leather, buffed and spotless with cream stitching along the seams. Overhead lighting ran warm and low, the kind of amber glow that softened edges and made everything look slightly more expensive than it already was. Each seat came with a personal screen, a noise-canceling headset still sealed in packaging, a slim menu printed on heavy cardstock, and a folded blanket made from something that felt like it had never been touched by a budget decision. I found seat 2A without difficulty, window seat, second row, left side. I slid my bag into the overhead bin, settled in, and spent approximately 30 seconds simply appreciating the legroom before pulling out my phone to text my father that I had boarded without incident. I almost sent that text. Almost. Row 1 was occupied by a man in his 60s who had already reclined his seat the maximum allowable angle and appeared to be asleep or performing sleep convincingly enough that no one would disturb him. Across the aisle in 1B, a woman in her late 30s was reviewing documents with the focused intensity of someone billing by the hour. Seat 2B, directly beside mine, was empty when I sat down. I assumed it would stay that way. I was wrong. I heard her before I saw her, not loudly. Vivian Hartwell was not the kind of woman who raised her voice. She had the particular vocal quality of someone who had spent decades understanding that volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be listened to. Every word she spoke landed at exactly the right register to be heard by precisely the people she intended to hear it and no one else. She came down the aisle in a cream linen blazer and tailored ivory trousers, a carry-on that I recognized as an Anya Hindmarch rolling bag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hair was silver blonde, cut in an architectural bob that required maintenance I couldn't calculate. Every detail about her, from the thin gold watch on her left wrist to the deliberate unhurriedness of her pace, communicated the same single message as clearly as if she had printed it on a sign, "I belong here more than you do." Behind her came Brooke Simmons, younger, maybe early 40s, in a structured blazer, the color of expensive red wine. She was the kind of woman who stood slightly behind Vivian in the way that certain people do, not from insecurity, but from the practiced positioning of someone who understood which of them was the axis and which was the orbit. They were assigned to seats 1C and 1D, which meant they would pass my route or reach theirs. Vivian's eyes moved over me as she passed. It was the same 2-second assessment Diane had performed at the gate, that rapid downward inventory, but where Diane's had been unconscious and automatic, Vivian's was deliberate, measured, the way you appraise something you've decided the value of before you finish looking. She said nothing directly to me. She settled into 1C, allowed Brooke to stow both their bags, and then as Brooke sat down in 1D, leaned slightly toward her and said just loud enough, "They really let anyone in here these days." She didn't look at me when she said it. That was intentional. Saying it without looking made it technically deniable. It was the linguistic equivalent of a hit-and-run: damage delivered, accountability avoided. Brooke made a soft sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite an agreement, but was both. I put in my headphones. This was the protocol I had developed over years of exactly these moments. Headphones in, music on, eyes forward. Do not react, because reacting was confirmation, and confirmation was what they wanted: proof that they had landed the blow, proof that they had the power to make me feel it. I selected a playlist my mother had made for me the summer before she got sick. Acoustic guitar mostly, a few jazz standards, the kind of music that felt like a hand on the shoulder. For approximately 8 minutes it worked. Then Stephanie Cross came to take drink orders. She was the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin. I had noticed her near the galley when I boarded her back to the aisle, arranging items with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same task so many times they required no conscious thought. She was tall, with her dark hair pulled back severely, and she moved through the cabin with the calibrated pleasantness of someone whose professional warmth was precisely controlled. She took the order from the sleeping man in row 1 without waking him, simply noted his earlier request apparently. She smiled at the woman reviewing documents. She came to Vivian and Brooke with an ease that went slightly beyond professional, a loosening around the eyes, a slight warming of the smile. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "wonderful to have you with us again." Vivian accepted this with the gracious inevitability of someone accustomed to being recognized. "The Sancerre, I think, and sparkling water." Brooke ordered the same. Then Stephanie turned to me. The warmth adjusted. Not disappearing entirely, she was too professional for that, but recalibrating the way a thermostat drops when the room changes. The smile remained, but something behind it didn't. "And for you?" she asked. "Just water, please," I said. "Still." She nodded and made a small note. Then, before she turned away, her eyes moved briefly, precisely from my face to my hoodie to my seat number. It lasted less than a second. She had probably done it without fully deciding to, but I saw it. And across the aisle, I noticed something I had not expected to notice. Vivian had also seen it. And Vivian was watching Stephanie's face with the quiet attentiveness of someone waiting for something she had been expecting to happen. In that single exchange, Stephanie's flicker, Vivian's watching, I understood suddenly that this was not the first time the two of them had been in the same first-class cabin, and that Vivian Hartwell was not a woman who left dynamics like this one to develop naturally. I pulled out my phone, opened my notes app, and then, almost without thinking about it, opened the second app beneath it, the recording app, the one my mother had made me download 3 years ago after the first time I'd been followed around a department store by a security guard and had no way to prove what had happened. "You can't fight what you can't document," she had told me, "so document everything." My thumb hovered over the button. I pressed it. The small red icon blinked once, then held steady. I locked my screen, slid the phone into the front pocket of my hoodie, and reached for the glass of water Stephanie had just set down without eye contact. Outside the window, the tarmac shimmered in the August heat. Ground crews moved in the distance. Somewhere below us, fuel was still flowing through pipes I didn't think about, managed by a company whose name was printed on contracts I had never read, run by a man who was at that moment sitting in a board meeting in downtown Chicago, checking his phone between agenda items. I didn't know yet what the next 40 minutes were going to cost me, but something in the air of that cabin, something in the way Vivian lifted her champagne glass and looked at me over the rim with an expression that was almost a smile, told me that I should pay attention. So I did. It started small. That is the thing I want people to understand about how these situations unfold. They do not begin with someone standing up and announcing their intentions. They begin with something that could still be explained away: a look, a comment, a question framed just carefully enough that the person asking it can claim later that they meant nothing by it. Vivian Hartwell was an expert at small. 20 minutes after takeoff, she called Stephanie over with a gesture so minimal it was almost imperceptible, just two fingers lifted slightly from the armrest, the way royalty summons. Stephanie appeared within seconds. I had my headphones on, but had turned the volume low enough to hear clearly. A habit. My mother's habit passed to me like an heirloom. I just want to make sure, Vivian said pleasantly, the way someone says something they have rehearsed until it sounds unrehearsed, that the seating assignments were confirmed correctly for this flight. I noticed some confusion at the gate. There had been no confusion at the gate, at least none that Vivian had witnessed. She hadn't been there. Stephanie glanced at me, just briefly. Is there a concern with a specific seat, Mrs. Hartwell? I'm sure it's nothing, Vivian said, lifting her champagne glass with the patience of someone who had all day. But the young lady in 2A, I just want to be certain everything is in order, for everyone's comfort. The phrase landed precisely as intended, not an accusation. A suggestion, a small seed planted in soil she had spent 20 minutes preparing. I took out one earbud, slowly, deliberately. My ticket is confirmed, I said, addressing Stephanie directly. Seat 2A, first class, purchased in full. I was scanned at the gate. There's no issue with my seat. Stephanie smiled the smile of someone navigating between two forces and calculating which one cost more to disappoint. Of course, she said smoothly. I'll just confirm with the system. She pulled out her tablet, typed, briefly looked at the screen. The confirmation was immediate. It had to be. My seat was legitimate. It had always been legitimate. Everything looks correct, she said with a professionalism that revealed nothing about what she actually thought. She looked at Vivian. Is there anything else I can get you, Mrs. Hartwell? Vivian smiled. Not at all. Thank you, Stephanie. It should have ended there. In a just world, it would have ended there. But Brooke had been quiet for too long, and quiet for Brooke appeared to be an unstable condition. I mean, she said in the tone of someone who prefaces cruelty with the illusion of casual observation. You don't see a lot of, she gestured vaguely, a movement designed to communicate everything, while technically saying nothing. Kids traveling alone in first class, without like a parent or something. I was 19 years old. I had been navigating international airports alone since I was 16. I had sat in lecture halls at Columbia discussing the constitutional implications of stop and frisk policies. I had read the full text of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for pleasure during a winter break when I was 14, because my mother had left her annotated copy on the kitchen table, and I had picked it up out of curiosity. I was not a child, and the word kid had been selected very deliberately by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing with it. I replaced my earbud, looked out the window, kept my breathing even. Brooke was undeterred by my non-response. If anything, she seemed energized by it. She picked up her phone casually, the way people pick up phones when they want to appear casual, and I saw in my peripheral vision the small movement of her camera lens turning in my direction. She was recording. I said nothing. I kept my eyes forward, and in the front pocket of my hoodie, the red icon on my own recording app continued to blink steadily. It was Kyle Mercer who escalated it. Kyle was the second flight attendant assigned to first class, younger than Stephanie, maybe late 20s, with the eager-to-please energy of someone still in the early years of a career where approval meant everything. He had been in the galley for most of the first 20 minutes of the flight, but he emerged now, and whatever Stephanie had said to him in the galley Whatever version of events she had relayed had arrived at him already shaped. He approached my row with the careful politeness of someone delivering bad news they believe is justified. "Miss," he said quietly, "I don't want to make this uncomfortable, but we've had a concern raised by another passenger about—" "About what specifically?" I asked. I kept my voice level. My mother had taught me to always ask for specificity. Vague concerns are impossible to disprove. Specific ones leave a trail. Kyle faltered slightly. "About the seating situation." "The seating situation," I repeated. "My confirmed paid scanned seat in first class." "I understand that. Do you?" I asked. Still calm, still quiet. "Because I'd like to understand what the actual concern is. Please be specific." Kyle looked toward the galley toward Stephanie. I assumed, seeking guidance, she wasn't in a position to provide from that distance. Then he looked back at me. "Mrs. Hartwell has expressed that she feels uncomfortable." The word hung in the recycled cabin air between us. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my mother sitting in courtrooms, facing arguments built from the same foundational material: discomfort, suspicion, the uneasy suggestion that someone's mere presence constituted a problem requiring resolution. "I'm sorry Mrs. Hartwell is uncomfortable," I said carefully, "but her discomfort isn't a policy violation, and it isn't a seating issue. My ticket is valid. I'm not disrupting anything. I'd like you to note this conversation, please, for the flight record." Kyle blinked. He had not expected that. The request to document was not in the script he had been handed. Yes," he said. "I can do that. Thank you." He retreated to the galley. Across the aisle, I felt rather than saw Vivian's attention sharpen. I had not behaved the way she expected. I hadn't gotten flustered, hadn't become defensive, hadn't raised my voice in a way that could be pointed to later as evidence of disruption. I had been specific, calm, and had introduced the concept of documentation into a situation she had been counting on remaining undocumented. I didn't look at her, but across the aisle, 3 rows back, I noticed for the first time the man I had not paid attention to before. He was perhaps 40 years old in a well-cut navy blazer, with a laptop open and a coffee going cold in the cup holder. He had been watching the entire exchange from behind reading glasses that he had stopped pretending to use several minutes ago. His name, I would learn later, was Daniel Cho. He was a civil rights attorney. He looked at me. I looked at him. For one full second, we held each other's gaze across the aisle of that first-class cabin. Then he looked down at his laptop and said nothing. The thing about a decision made in the wrong direction is that it compounds. One bad choice creates the conditions for the next one and the next until the original wrong feels almost inevitable in retrospect, as if each person involved had simply been following a logic that had already been set in motion before they arrived. That was how Trevor Rush ended up standing in the aisle of first class with his hand around my arm. It had taken 11 minutes from Kyle's retreat to the galley to the moment Trevor appeared at the front of the cabin. 11 minutes during which I had kept my headphones and my eyes forward and my breathing deliberate. 11 minutes during which Vivian had said nothing further out loud, but had exchanged 3 separate glances with Stephanie that carried the weight of a full conversation. 11 minutes during which Daniel Cho had stared at his laptop screen with the focused intensity of a man reading words he was not actually processing. Trevor was airport security, not airline staff, a distinction that would matter later in rooms I couldn't yet imagine. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s, in the Navy uniform of O'Hare's contracted security service. He had the particular bearing of someone who had been told many times that his physical presence was itself a form of authority. He came down the aisle without making eye contact with anyone, except Stephanie, who had met him at the galley entrance, and spoken to him in a voice too low for me to capture, even with my recording running. Whatever she told him had arrived at him, pre-shaped a version of events already assembled, cause already assigned, conclusion already reached. He stopped at row 2. "Miss," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who had already decided what the next sentence would be before they finished the first one. "I need you to come with me." I removed my headphones slowly. I set them in my lap. I looked up at him with full composure, because composure in this moment was not a performance. It was a tool, the most important one I had left. "On what basis?" I asked. "There's been a complaint filed regarding a disturbance in the cabin." "I haven't caused a disturbance," I said. "I've been sitting in my assigned seat with my headphones in. I'd like to know the specific nature of the complaint." Trevor shifted his weight slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me. We can discuss the details outside." Outside meaning off the plane. I said. He didn't answer. His silence was its own answer. I looked at Stephanie, who was standing at the galley entrance, with her hands clasped and her expression professionally neutral in the way that required significant effort to maintain. I looked at Kyle, standing slightly behind her, who had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable with what was unfolding. I looked at Vivian Hartwell, who had turned in her seat just enough to observe the proceedings, with the composed interest of someone watching a play she had already read. Then I looked at Daniel Cho. He was looking at me, reading glasses in his hand, now not on his face. Laptop closed. His jaw was tight. His eyes held something I recognized, the internal argument of a person who knows exactly what the right thing to do is and is trying to find a reason not to do it. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He looked away first. I turned back to Trevor. I want to note for the record, I said clearly in a voice calibrated to carry to every person in that cabin who had been pretending not to listen, that I have a valid first-class ticket for seat 2A, that I have not engaged in any disruptive behavior, that this removal is being conducted without a specific policy violation being cited, and that I am complying under protest. Trevor reached for my arm. His grip was not violent, but it was not gentle either, the grip of someone accustomed to people who resisted, applied preemptively to someone who had given him no reason to expect resistance. His fingers closed above my elbow with a firmness that would leave marks I wouldn't notice until later that evening, when I finally looked in a mirror and found 4 small bruises in a row on my inner arm. I stood. I did not pull away. Pulling away would have given him exactly the justification he hadn't yet earned. I gathered my bag from the overhead bin with my free arm. I kept my spine straight. From row 1, I heard Vivian begin to clap. Twice. 3 times. Slow, deliberate, the clapping of someone making a point. Finally, she said to no one and everyone. Thank you. Brooke laughed, a short, satisfied sound. My phone slipped from my hoodie pocket as Trevor guided me into the aisle. I felt it go before I heard it hit the floor, that weightless half-second before impact. It landed screen up, the recording app still glowing red, and slid 2 feet toward the row behind me. I turned instinctively. Trevor's grip tightened. Leave it, he said. That's my phone. It will be returned to you. Leave it. I looked at the phone on the floor. I looked at the recording app still running, still capturing. I thought about everything it had collected in the past 40 minutes, every word, every exchange, every deliberate calculation made by people who believe themselves unrecorded. I thought about my mother. You can't fight what you can't document. I let Trevor guide me forward. At the entrance to the jet bridge, I turned back one final time. The entire first-class cabin was visible from that angle, 12 seats, 11 passengers, 11 people who had watched everything and said nothing. Vivian settled back into her seat with the satisfaction of a task completed. Brooke already on her phone. Stephanie disappeared into the galley. Kyle staring at the floor. And Gloria Reyes, standing at the far end of the cabin near the rear galley curtain, where she had no professional reason to be. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was, I don't have a precise word for it. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that looked like recognition. Our eyes met across the length of the cabin, and this time she did not look away. Trevor guided me through the door and into the jet bridge. The door sealed behind us with a soft, pressurized click that sounded in that moment like punctuation. I sat down on the single plastic chair bolted to the jet bridge wall and set my bag on my knees and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. I was alone. I had no phone. I had no documentation in my hands. I had no way to reach my father, no way to reach a lawyer, no way to tell anyone what had just happened inside that cabin. I had nothing, except the certain, steady knowledge that I was not going to let this be the end of the story. I closed my eyes. 3 slow breaths, the way my mother had taught me. Then I opened them, and I started to think. The holding room was small enough that I could measure it in steps. 7 feet wide, maybe 10 feet long. A folding table bolted to the wall. 2 plastic chairs, the stackable kind you find in church basements and community centers. Overhead lighting that hummed at a frequency just high enough to be noticed. No windows. 1 door with a handle on the outside only. Trevor had brought me here without explanation, asked me to wait, and left. That had been, I counted the seconds on the wall clock opposite me 14 minutes ago. I had spent those 14 minutes doing what my mother had always told me to do. In any situation where I felt powerless, I cataloged what I actually had. No phone. That was the first column. No direct line to my father, no access to my email, No way to pull up the Skybridge passenger rights policy I had read approximately 18 months ago out of habit and had not expected to need in practice. That was the complete list of what I didn't have. The second column was longer. I had a valid first-class ticket confirmed and scanned at the gate. I had been removed from my seat without a specific policy violation being cited. Trevor had never named one. I had stated my compliance under protest out loud in a cabin with 11 witnesses. I had a recording running on my phone at the moment. It was separated from me, a phone that was still on that airplane, still recording in the custody of an airline whose employees had just participated in my removal. And I had my memory, which was my mother had always insisted the most underestimated legal instrument in existence. You are a witness to your own life, she had told me once, sitting at the kitchen table with a case file open in front of her and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. Never forget that. Whatever they take from you, they cannot take what you saw and heard and remembered. I closed my eyes and went through it systematically. Diane Walsh at the gate, the scan, the two-word dismissal, boarding, Gloria Reyes at the door, the cabin, Stephanie's recalibrated smile. Vivian's comment, the exact words they really let anyone in here these days, delivered at precisely calculated volume. Brooke's phone pointed at me. Kyle's approach, Trevor's grip, the specific location of the bruise forming above my elbow. The recording app still running on my phone on the floor of the cabin, capturing everything that happened after my removal. I opened my eyes, picked up the cheap ballpoint pen sitting on the folding table left there by someone for some unrelated purpose, and wrote everything I had just recalled on the back of my boarding pass, which I had transferred to my jacket pocket at the gate out of old habit. Date, time, seat number, names, where I had them descriptions, where I didn't sequence of events in chronological order. My mother had taught me that too. A timeline written immediately is worth more than a testimony given months later. Memory is honest right after the fact. It becomes a story later. The door opened. The young man who entered was maybe 24 in the standard O'Hare ground operations uniform, a different division from Trevor's security service, I noted. His badge read, Jesse Park Passenger Services. He had the look of someone who had been given an assignment he wasn't fully briefed on and was hoping it would resolve itself without requiring him to do anything specific. He set a small paper cup of water on the table. Can I get you anything else? He asked with the careful neutrality of someone who had been told to be neutral. My phone, I said. I'm not sure where. It's on the floor of the first-class cabin. Row 2. I'd like it returned, please. It was separated from me without my consent. Jesse wrote something in his notepad. I watched what he wrote. He underlined it once. It was progress of a kind. Is there a supervisor I can speak with? I asked. Mr. Davenport is the terminal operations manager on duty. He's been notified about the situation. Good, I said. I'd like to speak with him directly. Jesse nodded and retreated to the doorway. He paused there half in and half out, and I could see him wrestling with something, the specific discomfort of a person who understands that what they are witnessing is wrong, but hasn't yet decided whether that understanding obligates them to act on it. Miss Carter, he said finally, not quite meeting my eyes. I'm sorry about, I hope this gets sorted out quickly. It wasn't much, but it was the first thing anyone had said to me all morning that sounded like a human being talking to another human being, and I felt the weight of it land somewhere in my chest. Thank you, Jesse, I said. He left. The door didn't lock from the outside. I tested the handle after 30 seconds and confirmed it. I was not technically being detained. I was being contained by the social expectation that I would wait where I'd been put. I sat back down, thought about the phone on my father's desk, thought about the board meeting he had on Tuesdays, thought about the 4 seconds of silence on the other end of a call he'd answered, and heard nothing but ambient noise and then my sharp intake of breath before the line went dead. He would know. He always knew. But knowing wasn't enough. Knowing without documentation was just a father's word against an airline's lawyers, and I had watched my mother lose that particular calculation enough times to understand how the math worked. What I needed was not rescue. What I needed was a record. I looked at Jesse's notepad still sitting on the table where he'd forgotten it in his retreat. I looked at the door. I looked at the wall clock, 10:58 a.m. Flight 447 had been scheduled to push back at 10:45, which meant it was still at the gate or had just left it. I picked up the ballpoint pen again. On a fresh page of Jesse's notepad, I wrote the number I had memorized 3 years ago, when my mother made me memorize it the same way she made me memorize our home address and her office number and the non-emergency police line for our neighborhood. The FAA Consumer Hotline, 1-800-255-1111. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I stood up, walked to the door, opened it, and looked into the corridor. Jesse was visible at the far end, his back to me, speaking on a radio. 30 feet away, attached to the corridor wall beside a fire extinguisher, was a mounted landline telephone. The kind that existed in airports for exactly the category of emergency that didn't involve flames. I walked to it, picked it up, dialed. The line connected on the second ring. FAA Consumer Hotline. This is Agent Torres. How can I help you? I took one breath. Then I said in the clearest and steadiest voice I had, my name is Zoe Carter. I'm calling to report an incident that occurred approximately 30 minutes ago aboard Skybridge Airlines Flight 447 at O'Hare International Airport. I was removed from my confirmed first-class seat without a cited policy violation under physical restraint at the apparent instigation of another passenger. I am currently being held in a ground-level holding room. I want to file a formal report. A pause. Then, I'm going to need you to walk me through everything from the beginning, Miss Carter. Take your time. I looked once toward the end of the corridor where Jesse was still facing away. Then I turned back to the phone and began. 3 minutes later, a formal FAA incident report had been opened under case number YL-2024-0814-FC-003. 4 minutes after that, my father's phone rang. And 30 seconds after that, Marcus Carter stood up from his board meeting, walked out of the room without explanation, and made a call of his own. My father arrived at O'Hare in 41 minutes. I know the exact number because I had been counting. Not obsessively, practically. Time was evidence, too. Every minute documented was a minute that could be accounted for in a formal timeline. Jesse had returned my boarding pass notes without being asked, setting them on the table with the quiet deliberateness of someone making a small decision they had decided to commit to. I added the arrival time to the bottom of the page, 11:39 a.m. Marcus Carter did not come alone. He came with his general counsel, a woman named Patricia Osei, who wore her courtroom composure the way other people wore coats, naturally, completely in all weather. He came with 2 members of his personal security team who stationed themselves outside the holding room door with the unhurried certainty of people who understood that the most effective kind of authority never raises its voice. And he came with the specific quality of stillness that I had seen in him only a handful of times in my life, the absolute gathered calm of a man who was not angry yet because he had not yet decided to be, and who was saving that decision for the moment it would be most useful. He looked at me for a long moment when he came through the door. At my face, at my arm where the sleeve of my hoodie had ridden up enough to show the edge of the bruising, Trevor's grip had left. Something moved through his eyes that he controlled before it reached the rest of his face. He sat down across from me and said quietly, "Tell me everything." I told him everything. All of it in order the way I had rehearsed it into the FAA line 40 minutes earlier. He listened without interrupting. Patricia Osei took notes on a legal pad. When I finished, there was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. Then my father nodded, once stood up and walked back out the door. Patricia stayed. "You did exactly right," she told me. "The FAA case number is active. We have the timeline. Now we get the evidence." Within the hour, Carter Fuel Dynamics had formally suspended its fuel delivery contract with Skybridge Airlines at O'Hare, citing a contractual clause related to operational compliance reviews. It was entirely legal. It was entirely deliberate. 14 departures appeared on the board as delayed. 3 were grounded indefinitely pending refueling logistics. The O'Hare Operations Center began receiving calls from Skybridge's executive team within minutes. My phone was returned to me at 12:14 p.m. by a Skybridge ground manager, whose hands I noticed were not entirely steady. The recording app had been running for 1 hour and 47 minutes. It had captured everything from the moment I pressed the button in seat 2A to the moment Trevor separated it from me. And then, because the microphone was sensitive and the cabin acoustics were what they were, approximately 11 additional minutes of conversation in the first-class cabin after my removal that I had not been present for. I did not listen to it immediately. Patricia took it into evidence before I had the chance. I thought that was the turning point. I thought, sitting in that small room with my phone back in my hands and my father's lawyers moving efficiently through the corridor outside, that the worst was behind me. I was wrong. At 1:47 p.m., Brooke Simmons posted her video. It was 53 seconds long. It showed me being guided out of my seat by Trevor Rush, my bag over my shoulder, moving down the aisle toward the front of the cabin. It had been filmed from Brooks' angle in seat 1D, a perspective that captured my face and my movement and nothing else. No context preceding it. No audio of Vivian's comments of Kyle's approach of my stated compliance under protest. Just a young black woman in a green hoodie being removed from a first-class seat by a uniformed security officer. Brooks' caption read, "Passenger removed from first class after causing disturbance. Flight crew handled it professionally. Felt safe the whole time." By the time Patricia showed me the post, it had 47,000 views. I read the comments. I should not have read the comments. I knew intellectually that I should not have read the comments. But I read them anyway, the way you press on a bruise, not because you want it to hurt, but because some part of you needs to confirm the damage is real. Probably upgraded with miles and then got attitude about it. These people always think the rules don't apply to them. Good. If you cause problems, you get removed. Simple. I'm sure there's more to the story, but honestly, she doesn't look like she belongs there, lol. That last one was the one that did it. Not because it was the cruelest, it wasn't, but because it was the most honest articulation of every assumption that had been made about me that morning from the moment Diane Walsh looked up from her podium and ran her 2-second inventory. She doesn't look like she belongs there. I set the phone face down on the table. And for the first time all day, through Diane's dismissal, through Vivian's comment, through Trevor's grip, and the bruise forming on my arm, and the door closing behind me in the jet bridge, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few seconds of something breaking open behind my eyes that I had been holding back for hours, leaking out, despite everything I could do to prevent it. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder before I heard him come back into the room. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat down beside me, not across from me. Beside me the way he used to sit when I was small and had a nightmare. And he would come into my room and not ask what it was about, but just be there close enough to constitute an answer to a question I hadn't asked. After a moment, he said, 47,000 views. Yeah, I said. By tomorrow, it'll be 500,000. And every single one of them will see Brooks' 53 seconds. He paused. And then they'll see ours. I looked at him. Ours. Patricia Osei appeared in the doorway. She was holding a laptop and her expression had shifted. Something controlled and precise had entered it, the particular quality she got when a case moved from difficult to winnable. "We have the cabin footage," she said. "Sky Bridge resisted for 40 minutes and then their legal team looked at the fuel contracts and stopped resisting." She turned the laptop to face us. On the screen, the first-class cabin of Flight 447 from the overhead security camera angle. Time-stamped, unedited, every row visible. Every word audible. I stared at the screen. At Vivian's 2 fingers lifting from the armrest. At Stephanie leaning toward Kyle in the galley entrance. At Daniel Cho's glasses coming off his face as he stopped pretending to read. At Gloria Reyes standing at the far end of the cabin watching. My father leaned forward and studied the footage in silence for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "They recorded themselves." Patricia nodded. Every word, every gesture. The recording on Zoe's phone fills in the audio gaps. Together they are. She paused, choosing the word carefully, comprehensive. I thought about Brooks' 53 seconds, about 47,000 people reading that caption and drawing the conclusion they had already wanted to draw. Then I looked at the timestamp on the cabin footage. 1 hour and 31 minutes of uninterrupted overhead, wide-angle, fully lit truth. For the first time since 9:55 that morning, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not victory, not yet, but the solid, grounded certainty that the truth existed, that it was documented, and that it was ours. "Okay," I said. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, sat up straight, and reached for the legal pad. "Then let's start from the beginning." The truth, it turns out, does not move quickly. It moves carefully, methodically, with the particular patience of something that has been waiting a long time and understands that arriving correctly matters more than arriving fast. I know that now. In the days immediately following August 14th, I did not know it yet, and the not knowing was its own specific kind of difficult. The 48 hours after the incident were the longest I had experienced since my mother's final weeks. Not because of the legal machinery beginning to turn. Patricia and her team moved with a precision that was almost calming to watch, but because of what was happening outside that machinery in the world that operated on 53-second videos and caption-length verdicts. Brooks' post hit 400,000 views by the following morning. By the afternoon of August 15th, it had passed 1 million. Skybridge Airlines released a statement at 2 p.m. that described the removal as a standard response to a reported cabin disturbance. and expressed confidence that their crew had followed all established protocols. Three aviation industry commentators appeared on cable news to explain with great authority why passengers who cause disruptions in first class must be removed for the safety of everyone on board. Nobody mentioned my name. Nobody mentioned a ticket. Nobody mentioned that no specific policy violation had ever been cited. I watched it from my father's house in Lincoln Park, sitting at the kitchen table, where my mother used to spread her case files, and I understood for the first time at a cellular level what she had meant when she said that the hardest part of fighting for the truth was surviving the period before it arrived. Patricia called at 6 p.m. on August 15th. Her voice carried the controlled energy of someone delivering news they have been waiting to deliver. "Gloria Reyes is here," she said. I went still. Here meaning, sitting in our conference room. She came in 40 minutes ago without an appointment. She has her personal phone with her. A pause. "Zoe, she recorded the entire incident from the rear of the cabin. Wide angle. She's had it since the day it happened." I sat down. I hadn't realized I was standing. "She said she went home that night and couldn't sleep," Patricia continued. "She said she watched Brooke's video and read the comments, and then she looked at the footage on her own phone, and her words couldn't live with the distance between those two things." I thought about Gloria at the jet bridge door that morning, the held breath, the gaze that lasted a beat too long, the exhale I had heard behind me as I turned toward the cabin. She had been deciding then. She had been deciding all day. "She knows she may lose her job," Patricia said. "We'll protect her," I said immediately. "Whatever we need to do, we protect her." "Already working on it." The second call came the following morning. I did not expect it. Patricia put it through to me directly, which told me before I picked up that it was something she had decided I should handle myself. "Miss Carter." The voice was male, careful, with the measured quality of someone who had spent time choosing their words before dialing. "My name is Daniel Cho. I was a passenger in seat 4A on Skybridge Flight 447 on August 14th. I believe you may remember me." I remembered him. I remembered his reading glasses coming off. I remembered 3 seconds of eye contact across an aisle. I remembered him looking away. "I remember you," I said. A silence. "I want to offer a witness statement," he said. "A full one. Everything I saw and heard from boarding to your removal. I'm prepared to submit it formally and testify if the case goes to litigation." I waited. There was clearly more. "I told my daughter about what happened," he said. "What I saw, what I didn't do." Another pause, longer this time. "She's 14. She looked at me and asked why I didn't say anything. I didn't have an answer that I was willing to give her." His voice was steady but carried something beneath the steadiness. Not guilt exactly, but the weight of a man who had held himself to a standard and found himself short. "I'm a civil rights attorney. I have spent 20 years arguing that silence in the face of injustice is a form of participation. And then I sat in 4A and I participated." I was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Cho," I said finally, "I'll have Patricia reach out to you today." "Thank you," he said. "And Miss Carter, I'm sorry." "For what that's worth at this point." "It's worth something," I said. "It's worth a lot, actually." I meant it. The case against Skybridge Airlines' Stephanie Cross and Trevor Rush was filed in the Northern District of Illinois on August 22nd. The civil complaint named Vivian Hartwell as a co-defendant for her role in initiating and escalating the incident. It was 47 pages long and included 3 forms of audiovisual evidence, 2 witness statements, the FAA incident report filed from a corridor landline at 11:08 a.m. on August 14th, and a medical record documenting 4 contusion marks on the inner arm of Zoe Diana Carter, aged 19, consistent with forcible restraint. Patricia held a press conference the following morning. She released 90 seconds of the cabin footage, enough to establish context, not enough to compromise the litigation. The clip showed Vivian's 2-finger summons. It showed Stephanie's approach. It showed Kyle's visit to my row and my request for specificity. It showed Trevor's arrival, his grip, my stated compliance under protest, and Vivian's deliberate applause. 90 seconds. Brooke's 53 seconds had reached 1 million views in 18 hours. Patricia's 90 seconds reached 4 million in 6. The comments were different this time. Skybridge Airlines called Patricia at noon to discuss settlement. She told them she would be available the following week, which was not true, but was the correct thing to say. Stephanie Cross was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Trevor Rush was suspended with pay a distinction, Patricia noted in a follow-up filing, with language that made clear we considered it insufficient. Vivian Hartwell's husband, State Senator Richard Hartwell, released a statement through his communications director expressing that he was deeply troubled by the allegations and had no prior knowledge of the events described. Patricia sent me the statement with a single line of her own appended beneath it. "He'll do better than that before this is over." She was right. But the moment I returned to most in the nights that followed, the moment that sat with me, the way certain things sit with you when you're trying to understand what something meant was not the press conference, not the filing, not the 4 million views. It was Gloria Reyes sitting across from me in Patricia's conference room on the evening of August 15th, her personal phone on the table between us, her hands folded on top of it. She had looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. Then she said, "I've been a flight attendant for 11 years. I've seen this happen before. Not exactly like this, but the shape of it. Someone in a seat they're not expected to be in. Someone deciding that's a problem. I always found a reason to look away." She paused. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that I needed the job, that one person speaking up wouldn't change anything. I waited. I watched that video Brooke posted," she said, "and I thought about the 11 years of reasons I had given myself. And I thought," her voice steadied, "if not now, then those 11 years mean nothing. And I didn't want them to mean nothing." She slid the phone across the table to Patricia. "I thought about my mother, about a shelf of case files representing people who couldn't fight alone, about a woman who had spent 22 years showing up for strangers because she believed that justice was not a spectator event. I thought about 11 years of looking away and one evening of deciding not to. Sometimes the bravest thing is not the person who never hesitates. Sometimes it is the person who hesitated for 11 years and then finally did not." The settlement was reached on a Thursday morning in late October, 73 days after August 14th. $3.1 million, paid by Skybridge Airlines, their liability insurer, and Vivian Hartwell's legal team, in proportions that Patricia negotiated with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this long enough to know exactly which numbers each party could live with and which ones they couldn't. The agreement included mandatory bias training for all Skybridge cabin crew nationwide, the implementation of an independent passenger complaint review board, and a formal written apology from the airline's CEO, not a statement through a communications director, not a carefully worded expression of concern. A letter, signed, specific, addressed to me by name. Stephanie Cross did not return to her position. Her aviation credentials were under review by the FAA as a separate proceeding. Trevor Rush completed a mandatory retraining program and returned to a ground operations role with conditions attached that Patricia had insisted on and the airport authority had accepted without the resistance we had expected. Vivian Hartwell's civil liability settlement was sealed, but Senator Richard Hartwell announced 3 weeks later that he would not seek re-election at the end of his term. His communications director cited a desire to spend more time with family. Patricia sent me that press release too without comment. I directed every dollar of the settlement into a fund. I named it the Diana Carter Legal Fund. My mother had spent 22 years representing people who couldn't afford to fight back. The fund would do what she had done, but with structure, with a staff of attorneys, a case intake system, a network of partner organizations across Illinois, and eventually beyond. By the end of the year, we had accepted 41 cases. Discrimination in housing, in employment, in public accommodations. People who had been told in various ways in various settings that they did not belong in the space they had paid for, or earned, or simply had the right to occupy. People who had no Gloria Reyes, no Daniel Cho, no recording app running quietly in a front pocket. We tried to be those things for them. 6 months after August 14th, I returned to O'Hare International Airport for the first time. I went alone. My father had offered to come. Patricia had offered to send someone. I told them both that I needed to do this particular thing by myself, and they understood, or at least accepted the distinction. I arrived 2 hours early the way I always did. Force of habit. Force of my father's insistence absorbed so completely over 19 years that it had become my own. I bought a black coffee from the same kiosk near gate G14 and found a seat by the window. Below on the tarmac, planes moved in the gray February light. Ground crews in orange vests guided them with the patient authority of people who understood that the most important work happened closest to the ground. The gate agent at G14 was someone I hadn't seen before, a young man who checked my boarding pass with the brisk professionalism of someone doing his job correctly and without subtext. He handed my phone back and said, "Have a good flight, Miss Carter," and meant nothing by it except exactly what he said. I thanked him and walked down the jet bridge. I found seat 2A and sat down. same seat, same window, same amber lighting overhead, same leather armrests, same small architecture of a space that had been 6 months ago the site of something I would carry for the rest of my life. It felt different, and it felt the same the way places do after something has happened in them. The geography unchanged, everything else altered. I set my bag down, pulled out my phone, opened it to the last text in my father's thread. Proud of you every single day. Your mother too. Go be exactly who she raised you to be. I read it twice. Then I opened the folder I kept in my photos, the one labeled Simply Mom, and found the image I looked at when I needed to remember what I was doing and why. Her at her desk laughing at something off camera, a case file open in front of her, and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Taken on an ordinary Tuesday, no occasion, just a Tuesday. She had spent 22 years doing the work because she believed that dignity was not a privilege distributed unevenly based on appearance or wealth or how someone carried themselves through an airport terminal. She believed it was a baseline, a floor below which no person should be permitted to fall without someone standing up and saying, "This is not acceptable, and I will not look away." She had raised me inside that belief so thoroughly that I could not have separated it from myself if I had tried. I had not looked away. I closed the photo, opened my laptop. The Diana Carter Legal Fund intake queue had 12 new cases since yesterday morning. 41 families were moving through the process. Gloria Reyes had joined our advisory board the previous month, combining her 11 years of aviation industry knowledge with the specific authority of someone who understood from the inside how these systems failed and where they could be changed. Daniel Cho had taken 2 of our cases pro bono and was preparing arguments for a third. The plane began to move. I looked out the window at the tarmac sliding past at the gray Chicago sky above it, at the city receding as we climbed. I thought about Diane Walsh at the gate running her 2-second inventory, about Vivian's 2 lifted fingers, about a door closing behind me in a jet bridge, about a corridor landline and an FAA case number, and a man standing up from a board meeting and walking out without explanation. About a flight attendant who had looked away for 11 years and then one evening had not. About the difference between those 2 things. About how thin the line was between them and how much it mattered which side of it you stood on. My mother used to say that justice was not a destination. It was a direction, a choice made continuously in ordinary moments by ordinary people who understood that the alternative, the looking away, the going flat, the deciding, it wasn't their place, had a cost that compounded silently until someone, somewhere, paid it all at once. I had paid it on August 14th in seat 2A, but I had also chosen a direction, and I intended to keep walking in it for as long as it took, for as many people as needed someone to walk beside them, for my mother who had shown me how, for myself who had finally learned. So that's the story of August 14th. The story of seat 2A, a 4-second phone call, and 14 flights that never left the ground. But here's what I keep coming back to, even now. The moment that changed everything wasn't the fuel contracts. It wasn't the settlement. It wasn't even the cabin footage going to 4 million views in 6 hours. It was Gloria Reyes walking into a law office she'd never been to before setting her phone on a conference table and saying, "I can't live with the distance between what I know and what I did." It was Daniel Cho calling his daughter, hearing her question, and not being willing to give her the easy answer. It was a 19-year-old girl sitting alone in a windowless room with a ballpoint pen and a boarding pass, writing down everything she remembered in chronological order, because her mother had taught her that a timeline written immediately is worth more than a testimony given months later. The question I want to leave you with is the one Daniel Cho's daughter asked him, not directed at him, directed at all of us. If you had been in seat 4A that morning, what would you have done? I don't ask it as a judgment. I ask it the way my mother asked hard questions, as a genuine inquiry, because the answer matters and because the person most worth asking is always yourself. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And while you're there, tell me where you're watching from and your local time. This story has traveled to places I never expected, and I want to know how far. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think or remember or reconsider something, hit the like button. It takes 2 seconds and it means more than you know. And if you want to be here for the next story, subscribe, because there are more. There are always more, and every one of them belongs to someone who needed someone else to refuse to look away. Thank you for staying until the end. It matters that you did.